The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the Icefang Citadel, a deep, ancient chill that seeped through the worn leather of her slippers and settled into her bones. Ilara felt it as a familiar ache, a reminder of what she was: an exile, a defect, worthless. Here, in the heart of the Alpha King's frozen domain, she was less than a ghost. She was just another pair of hands, scrubbing pots in the cavernous kitchens, her head bowed, her presence meant to be forgotten. Her own pack had cast her out a year ago. The words of the elder shaman still echoed in her memory, sharp and cruel as shards of ice. Barren, a blight on the soil. Her touch withers the new growth. It was true. A strange coldness lived in her fingertips. The seedlings she'd tried to nurture for the spring festival had shriveled and died. The other girls had bloomed, their connection to the life of the pack vibrant and strong. Hers was a void, a place where warmth went to die. They had branded her with a small, neat circle of scarred flesh on her wrist, the mark of the unwanted, and sent her into the wilderness to be claimed by winter or a merciful predator. Neither had taken her. Instead, a patrol of King Theron's wolves had found her, half-frozen and delirious, and dragged her here to serve. Servitude was a kinder fate than freezing, but the shame was a heavier burden than any bucket of icy water she was forced to carry. The kitchen was a cacophony of noise and steam. The head cook, a burly she-wolf named Marta, ruled with an iron ladle and a voice that could curdle milk. She despised Ilara on sight, seeing the brand on her wrist. To Marta, Ilara was not just an exile, she was bad luck, a contagion of failure that might spoil the king's stew. "You, girl!" Marta barked, pointing a sausage-like finger. "The floors don't scrub themselves, and keep those cursed hands of yours away from the herbs." Ilara flinched, pulling her hands into the sleeves of her rough-spun tunic. "Yes, Marta." The words were a whisper, swallowed by the clatter and roar of the kitchen. She knelt, the cold of the flagstones biting into her knees, and began to scrub. The lye in the soap stung the raw skin of her hands, but the pain was a distraction. It was physical, easy to understand. It was the other ache, the one in her chest, that she could never seem to scour away. She worked in silence, a small, hunched figure moving through the chaos. She learned to make herself invisible, to anticipate orders before they were shouted, to exist in the margins. The others gave her a wide berth. They whispered about her, the blighted one, the girl with winter in her veins. She never looked them in the eye. To meet their gaze was to see her own worthlessness reflected back at her. Sometimes, late at night when the kitchens were finally quiet and dark, she would sit by the dying embers of the hearth, the only source of warmth. She would hold her hands out, studying them in the faint orange glow. They looked like any other hands, slender, pale, crisscrossed with small scars from her work. But she knew what they were. They were instruments of decay, the proof of her failure. Why her? The question was a constant, useless refrain in her mind. She had been born of a strong bloodline. She had been devout in her duties, kind in her heart. But the goddess had passed her over, leaving her empty and cold. A vessel with a crack in it, unable to hold the life that was supposed to flow through her. She was broken. Her only solace was in memory. She remembered her grandmother, a woman whose hands had been gnarled with age but always warm. Her grandmother had been deaf, and she had taught Ilara the silent language, the beautiful, flowing dance of the hands that could speak volumes without a sound. It was a secret language, just for them. A way to talk when the world was too loud. Now, it was just another useless piece of her past, a skill with no purpose in a place where no one wanted to speak to her at all. One afternoon, a hush fell over the kitchen. It was so sudden, so absolute, that Ilara looked up from her bucket, her heart lurching. The usual clamor of pots, pans, and shouted orders had ceased. Everyone was frozen, their eyes fixed on the arched doorway. A small figure stood there, silhouetted against the light from the corridor. A child. She was tiny, no more than 6 or 7 years old, with a cascade of silver blonde hair that fell to her waist. She wore a simple dress of dark blue velvet, the fabric looking out of place in the grimy kitchen. Her eyes, wide and the color of a winter sky, scanned the room with a solemn, unnerving stillness. It was the princess, Lyra. Alara had only heard whispers of her, the king's only child, the sole survivor of the massacre that had claimed the queen and the rest of the royal pups years ago. They said the girl had been found hiding under her mother's body, soaked in blood, but physically unharmed. They also said she had not spoken a word since. Marta recovered first, her face a mixture of panic and false deference. She wiped her hands on her apron and bustled forward, bowing low. "Princess, you should not be in here. It is unclean. Allow me to escort you back to your chambers." The child did not respond. Her gaze drifted past the cook, past the nervous kitchen staff, and settled on Alara. It was not a hostile gaze, just curious, as if she were looking at a strange insect she'd never seen before. While Marta fussed, the princess took a tentative step into the kitchen. In her small hand, she clutched a little wooden wolf, its form worn smooth from countless hours of handling. As she moved, her foot caught on an uneven flagstone. She stumbled, and the little wolf flew from her grasp, skittering across the slick floor until it came to a stop right beside Alara's bucket. Lyra's face, which had been so still, crumpled in distress. A tiny, silent gasp escaped her lips. Marta and the others were too afraid to move. The king's daughter was precious and fragile, and no one wanted to be responsible for upsetting her further. They just stared. Alara didn't think. She simply acted. She reached out and picked up the small wooden wolf. The carved toy was cool against her skin. She rose slowly, her knees protesting, and took a hesitant step toward the princess. Everyone held their breath. She was the blighted one, about to touch the silent princess. She knelt before the child, holding out the toy on her open palm. Lyra looked from the wolf to Alara's face, her sky-blue eyes searching. She seemed to see past the grime and the fear, looking at something deeper. Then her tiny, pale fingers reached out and plucked the wolf from Alara's hand. Her skin brushed against Alara's. Alara braced for the inevitable flinch, the recoil from her cursed cold. But it never came. The child simply held her wolf, her fingers curled around it, her eyes still locked on Alara. And in that moment, something shifted in Alara, a forgotten instinct. She remembered her grandmother's warm smile and the secret language they shared. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised her other hand. She curled her fingers, extending her thumb, pinky, and index finger, and tapped her chin twice. It was a simple sign, one of the first her grandmother had taught her. Friend. The princess's eyes widened, a flicker of something, understanding, surprise, wonder, danced in their depths. She tilted her head, mesmerized by the silent word hanging in the air between them. A shadow fell over the doorway. It was vast and absolute, a sudden eclipse of the light. The temperature in the room plummeted, the steam from the cauldron seeming to freeze in the air. A presence of immense power and crushing grief filled the space, and Alara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. King Theron stood there. He was even larger than the stories claimed, a mountain of a man clad in black leather and dark furs. His hair was the color of midnight, streaked with silver at the temples, and his face was a harsh, beautiful mask carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held the true terror. They were the color of molten gold, and they burned with a cold fire, the flames of a grief so profound it had become a weapon. He was the Alpha King, the Wolf of the North, the broken king who had reigned alone for a century. His golden eyes swept the room, and every person in it, including Marta, dropped into a deep bow, their faces pressed to the floor. All except two. The little princess, who simply stared at her father, and Alara, who was frozen on her knees, too terrified to move, her hand still half raised in the forgotten sign. The king's gaze landed on his daughter, and the inferno in his eyes softened to a flicker of pained concern. Then his eyes moved to Alara, and the fire roared back to life. He saw her proximity to his child, saw her filthy tunic and the branded wrist she'd forgotten to hide. His expression was one of absolute murderous fury. He moved. He did not walk. He flowed across the room, a predator closing in on its prey. The air crackled around him. He was a storm about to break. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. She had overstepped. She had touched his precious daughter. He would kill her where she knelt. He stopped directly in front of them, looming over her. The sheer force of his presence was suffocating. "What?" he began, his voice a low growl like the shifting of glaciers. "Is going on here?" Marta, still on the floor, stammered. "Your Majesty, the exile." She accosted the princess. I was just about to remove her. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. But the king did not look at Marta. His gaze was fixed on his daughter. He was looking for a sign of distress, of fear. He expected to see Lyra recoiling from Alara, pulling away from the strange, dirty servant. But Lyra was not recoiling. She was standing perfectly still, clutching her wooden wolf, her gaze shifting between Alara's face and her frozen hand. She took a tiny, deliberate step closer to Alara, her small shoulder brushing against Alara's arm. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, but in the charged silence of the room, it was a thunderclap. It was an act of shielding. King Theron froze. The fury in his eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of stunned confusion. He had not seen his daughter willingly approach another soul in years. She tolerated her nurses, her guards, even him. But she never sought contact. She was a ghost in her own home, flitting through the halls untouchable. His gaze dropped to Alara, really seeing her for the first time. He saw the terror in her eyes. Yes, but beneath it there was no malice. Only a deep, abiding sadness that seemed to mirror the one in his own soul. He saw the ugly brand on her wrist. He saw her chapped, raw hands. And he saw the faint, lingering shape of the sign she had made. "You," he commanded, his voice softer now, but no less absolute. "Speak. What did you do to my daughter?" Ilara found her voice, though it was thin and trembling. "Nothing, Your Majesty. She dropped her toy. I only returned it to her." "And your hand?" He pressed, his golden eyes narrowed. "What was that gesture?" She swallowed hard, the truth feeling dangerous. "It is a word. From a silent language. My grandmother was deaf." "What word?" The silence stretched. Ilara's fear was a cold knot in her stomach. "Friend," she whispered. The word fell into the stillness of the room and seemed to hang there, shimmering and impossible. The Alpha King stared at her, his mask of cold fury cracking. He felt something then, a strange, unwelcome warmth spreading through his chest. It was the whisper of a bond, a connection he had thought long dead and buried with his mate. It was impossible. This branded exile? This slip of a girl who smelled of lye soap and fear? And yet, his wolf, the ancient beast that lived within him, was stirring. It recognized something in her, something that had nothing to do with rank or status, something essential. He looked back at Lyra. His daughter, his silent, broken child, lifted her own small hand and clumsily tried to mimic the sign Alara had made. It was a poor imitation, but the intent was clear. Theron felt the world tilt on its axis. He made a decision. Swift, absolute, as was his way. He raised his voice, addressing the entire room without looking away from Alara. "Everyone, out, now." There was a frantic scramble as the kitchen staff fled, Marta shooting Alara a look of pure venom before she scurried away. In moments, the vast kitchen was empty, save for the king, the princess, and the kneeling exile. Theron crouched down, bringing himself to their level. The intensity of his golden gaze was overwhelming. He looked at Alara, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "You will be moved from the kitchens. You will be assigned to the princess's wing. Your new duty is to be her companion." Alara's mind went blank with shock. Your Majesty? "You will teach her this language of yours," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "You will not leave her side. Is that understood?" She could only nod, mute with disbelief. "Good." He straightened to his full, intimidating height. He held out a hand to his daughter. "Lyra, come." Lyra looked at her father's outstretched hand, then back at Alara. For a heart-stopping moment she hesitated. Then she reached out and slipped her tiny hand into his massive one. But as he led her from the room, she looked back over her shoulder, her pale blue eyes fixed on Alara, a silent question shining in their depths. Alara remained on her knees on the cold stone floor, trembling. The Alpha King had not killed her. He had elevated her. He had looked at her, the blighted one, and seen something other than a curse. She didn't understand. A terrifying, fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in her chest, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. Her new life was a gilded cage. She was moved from the damp, crowded servants' quarters to a small, clean room adjoining the princess's suite. It had a real bed with woolen blankets and a window that looked out over the endless, snow-covered pines of the northern forest. She was given new clothes, simple but well-made dresses of soft gray wool. She was no longer a kitchen drudge. She was something else. But she was still a prisoner. Guards stood posted at the end of the corridor. Her world was now confined to these lavishly appointed rooms, her only companion, the silent child. And she was watched. Always. She could feel his eyes on her, even when he was not there. The Alpha King was a constant presence, a weight in the air. He would appear without warning, a dark shadow in the doorway, his golden eyes assessing, unreadable. He never stayed long. He would watch her and Lyra for a few moments, his face an impenetrable mask, and then he would be gone, leaving behind an unsettling silence and the faint scent of winter and pine. The arrangement was unspoken but clear. This was a transaction. Her duty was to his daughter. Nothing more. He had made that plain in one of their first stilted conversations. "You will attend to her needs," he had stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You will not speak of your past. You will not speak to any other members of my court. Your world is Lyra. Do you understand this, exile?" The word exile was a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of her place. "Yes, Your Majesty." And so she poured herself into her task. Lyra was a skittish fawn, easily startled, retreating into her shell of silence at the slightest disturbance. But with Alara, she slowly, cautiously began to open up. The silent language became their world. Ilara taught her the signs for sun and moon, for wolf and tree, for happy and sad. Lyra was a quick study. Her small hands, once so still, now moved with a growing confidence, weaving stories in the air. She told Alara about her dreams, about the colors she liked best, about the funny shape of a cloud she'd seen from the window. For the first time since the massacre, the child had a voice. Alara discovered a fierce, protective love for the girl growing in her heart. Lyra was not broken, just wounded. And in helping to heal her, Ilara felt a small part of her own brokenness begin to mend. The king watched it all. One evening, he entered the room to find them sitting by the fire, Ilara's hands dancing as she signed a story about a mischievous star, and Lyra's face, for the first time Ilara had ever seen, was lit with a silent, breathless giggle. Theron stopped dead in the doorway, his heart clenching in his chest, a ghost of a smile. He had not seen his daughter smile in 5 years. The sight was a dagger to his soul, beautiful and excruciatingly painful. He cleared his throat, and the moment was shattered. Lyra's smile vanished. Ilara's hands dropped to her lap. "What was the story about?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Ilara kept her eyes downcast. "Just a silly tale, Your Majesty, about a star who wanted to learn to swim." He stepped further into the room. "Show me the sign for star." Surprised, Ilara hesitated, then raised her hands, index fingers extended, and brushed them against each other in an alternating rhythm. He watched the movement, his expression unreadable. "And swim?" She flattened her palms and moved them forward in a gentle, undulating motion. He copied it, his large, powerful hands looking almost clumsy as they mimicked the sign. The sight was so unexpected, so strangely intimate, that Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck. This became a new ritual. His visits grew longer. He would sit in a chair by the fire, a silent, brooding sentinel, and ask her to teach him the words Lyra had learned that day. Home, family, love. Each sign she taught him felt like a confession, a secret whispered between them in the quiet language of hands. She was starting to see past the mask of the cold, ruthless king. She saw the grieving father, the lonely man, the wolf who had lost his pack. One night she found a small withered rose in a vase on Lyra's bedside table. The princess must have asked one of the maids for it. It was already browning at the edges, drooping sadly. Lyra was looking at it, her face clouded with disappointment. She signed to Ilara, "Make it better?" Ilara's heart ached. She reached out to touch the flower, to straighten its stem, and then stopped, her hand hovering just above the petals. She remembered the seedlings. She remembered the shaman's words. A blight. "I can't," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "I'm sorry, Lyra. I break things." She didn't realize he was there until he spoke from the shadows behind her. "What do you mean by that?" She spun around, startled. King Theron was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He had seen the entire exchange, had seen the look of self-loathing on her face. "Your Majesty," she stammered, curtsying awkwardly. "I did not hear you." "I know," he said, his voice quiet. He pushed off the doorframe and walked towards them. He looked at the dying rose, then at her. "You said you break things. Explain." She couldn't meet his eyes. The shame was a physical thing, a cold weight in her stomach. "It is why I was exiled," she said, her voice barely audible. "My touch. It is cold. Life does not thrive around me. Plants wither. I was declared defective." She braced herself for his reaction, disgust, revulsion, an order for her to be removed immediately, to be taken away from his precious daughter. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. Then, he did something that shocked her to her core. He reached out and gently took her hand. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to her own perpetual chill. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. It was not a gesture of passion, but of contemplation. He held her hand as if it were a strange artifact he was trying to understand. "It is cold," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled up her arm. He looked from her hand to her face, his golden eyes searching hers. "But it is not the touch of death. I have felt that. This is something else entirely." The contact was electrifying. A jolt of warmth, his warmth, shot through her, a sensation so alien she gasped. The boundary he had so carefully constructed between them, the one she had so dutifully respected, had just been incinerated by a single touch. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. He released her hand abruptly, stepping back, his mask of indifference slamming back into place. But it was too late. They had both felt it. The spark of the bond, undeniable and terrifying. He turned away, his broad back rigid. "I lost my mate in this room," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all royalty. "She was murdered by men I called my brothers. They killed her and my sons, right where you are standing." Alara's breath hitched. He had never spoken of it. No one spoke of it. "For a century," he continued, his voice thick with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room, "this castle, this kingdom, my very soul, has been frozen. I have felt nothing but the ice, until you came." He finally turned to look at her, and the agony in his eyes was a physical blow. "I do not want to feel exile. I do not want to hope. It is a weakness I cannot afford." He stared at her, his jaw tight. "My daughter is healing. For that, you have my gratitude. But do not mistake it for anything else. There is a chasm between us that can never be crossed." He turned and strode from the room, leaving Alara with a racing heart, the phantom warmth of his touch still lingering on her skin, and his devastating words echoing in the silence. The boundary had not been rebuilt. It had been carved into stone. The king's confession changed everything. The fragile peace Alara had found was replaced by a humming tension. The air between them was now charged with the things he had said and the things he had forbidden. A chasm, he had called it. But all Alara could feel was the terrifying magnetic pull from the other side. He avoided her. His visits to Lyra's chambers became brief and formal once more. He would speak only to his daughter, using the clumsy signs Alara had taught him. He would not look Alara in the eye, but she felt his gaze on her when she wasn't looking. She would turn and catch the flicker of his golden eyes before he looked away. His expression shuddered. He was fighting a war within himself, and she was the unwilling battlefield. Meanwhile, Lord Valerius watched. The king's chief advisor was a silver-haired wolf with eyes the color of chipped slate. He moved through the court with a quiet, serpentine grace, his smiles never quite reaching his eyes. He had been Theron's right hand for decades, the one constant in the king's frozen world, and he did not like what he was seeing. He saw the life returning to the princess's eyes. He saw the cracks in the king's icy facade. He saw the branded exile who was the cause of it all. A healing king was a strong king, a king who might start looking too closely at the past, at the convenient betrayals that had left Valerius in a position of such influence. An isolated, grieving monarch was much easier to manage. Valerius began his work subtly, a spider weaving an invisible web. He started with whispers in the corridors, questions posed to influential lords and ladies. Is it wise to have such a defective creature so close to the royal heir? An exile, they say, cast out for being a blight on her own people. He let the poison spread slowly. He knew Theron's only vulnerability, the one raw nerve that could still be touched, his fierce, paranoid protection of his daughter. A week after Theron's confession, Valerius requested a private audience with the king. He found Theron in the throne room, staring out the great arched window at the falling snow. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice a smooth balm of feigned concern. "Forgive my intrusion, but my conscience compels me to speak on a matter of great importance." Theron did not turn. "Speak then, Valerius." "It is about the exile girl, Alara." Valerius let the name hang in the air. "I have, of course, been overjoyed to see the progress the young princess has made. The girl has been a curiosity. But I have had my agents look into the circumstances of her banishment. This got Theron's attention. He turned slowly, his golden eyes narrowed. And? Valerius bowed his head, a perfect picture of reluctant duty. The reports are troubling, my king. It is as the whispers say. She was not merely exiled for being barren. They called her a life drain, a creature whose very touch saps the vitality from living things. Crops failed in her presence. Newborn livestock sickened. Her own pack feared she carried a curse. He paused, letting the words sink in. We have all seen the princess flourish. But what if this is a different kind of magic? A siphoning? What if the girl is not healing Lyra, but merely borrowing her life, blooming herself while the princess is slowly drained? The child is already so fragile. Every word was a carefully chosen dart aimed directly at Theron's deepest fear. The idea was monstrous, preposterous, but it played on the truth of what he knew. Ilara's cold touch, her own admission that she broke things. Doubt, cold and venomous, began to coil in the king's gut. He remembered the warmth he'd felt in her hand, the spark of the bond. Was it a lie? A trick? A glamour to hide a parasitic nature? His love for his daughter was a ferocious, absolute thing. It eclipsed all else. It was the one star left in his black sky. Any threat to it, no matter how small, had to be extinguished. That evening, he stormed into Lyra's chambers. Ilara was brushing the child's silver blonde hair, her hands moving with gentle care. Lyra was signing a story to her, her face animated. They both looked up, startled, as the king entered. The atmosphere of quiet peace shattered. Theron's face was a thundercloud. He looked only at Ilara, his voice like the crack of a whip. Is it true? Ilara's heart stopped. Your Majesty? Your exile, he snarled, advancing on her. They call you a life drain, a curse. Is it true? The accusation, so raw and public, hit her like a physical blow. She saw Lyra flinch, her hands falling still. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at his furious, tormented eyes and saw that the trust they had started to build was gone, replaced by the cold steel of suspicion. She could not lie to him. Not about this. It was the core of her shame. They said those things. Yes, she stammered, her voice breaking. The seedlings died. I don't know why. Her admission was all the confirmation he needed. Valerius's poison had found fertile ground. The king's face hardened into the granite mask she had first seen in the kitchen. You will be confined to your room, he commanded, his voice glacial. You are not to see or speak to my daughter again. The guards will see to it. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. She looked past him to Lyra, whose small face was a mask of confusion and horror. The child reached a hand out to her, her lips forming a silent no. Please, Your Majesty, Ilara begged, taking a step forward. I would never harm her. You must believe me. I believe that I was a fool to let a stray like you near my blood, he bit out, the words laced with self-loathing and fury. He turned his back on her, a gesture of final, absolute dismissal. Guards. 2 armored wolves entered the room. They took Ilara by the arms, their grips bruising. She didn't struggle. She was numb with shock and a grief so profound it stole her breath. As they dragged her from the room, she looked back at Lyra. The little girl was standing by her father's side, tugging on his tunic, her face streaked with silent tears, her hands making the sign for friend over and over again, a frantic, desperate plea. But the king would not look. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his golden eyes fixed on a future he was determined to protect, even if it meant ripping his own heart out to do so. The door slammed shut, and Ilara was plunged back into the cold. The silence of her room was a living thing. It pressed in on her from all sides, a suffocating blanket woven from despair. For 2 days, she saw no one but the stoic guard who brought her meager meals and the changing of the light at her small window. The hope that had so painfully bloomed in her chest had been ripped out by the roots, and the old, familiar worthlessness settled back into its place. He was right. She was a curse. She had allowed herself to forget, to dream that she could be something more. She had let herself care for the broken princess and her grieving father, and in doing so, had only brought them more pain. The king's words echoed in her mind. A stray? A fool? She believed them. But it was the separation from Lyra that was the true torture. It was a physical ache, a hollow space in her soul. She worried constantly. Was the child eating? Was she retreating back into her shell of silence? Did she think Alara had abandoned her? The not knowing was a slow, grinding agony. On the third day, a subtle wrongness began to permeate the air. A tension that had nothing to do with her own confinement. She heard hurried footsteps in the corridor, hushed, panicked whispers. Something was wrong. Late that night, a young maid, one of the few who had ever shown her a sliver of kindness in the kitchens, was sent to collect her dinner tray. The girl's eyes were wide with fear. "What is it?" Alara whispered, grabbing the girl's arm. "What's happened?" The maid, Elspeth, glanced nervously at the guard down the hall. "It's the princess," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "She's fallen ill, a terrible fever. The royal healers have been with her all day, but nothing works. She's fading." A cold dread, colder than any she had ever known, washed over Alara. No, it couldn't be. They're saying it started the day you were locked away," Elspeth added, her eyes full of a mixture of pity and suspicion. "They're saying it's your curse, taking root in her." The girl pulled her arm away and fled, leaving Alara alone with the horrifying news. Lyra was sick. Lyra was fading. And they were blaming her. The news spread through the castle like a plague. The exile's blight had finally shown its true nature. She had infected the princess, and now, from her cell, she was draining the child's life away. Lord Valerius fanned the flames, his face a mask of grim vindication. He had warned the king, he told the court. He had tried to protect the royal line. Theron was a caged beast. He did not leave his daughter's bedside. He watched, helpless, as the fever consumed her. Her skin was parchment pale, her breathing shallow. She was unresponsive, lost in a world of burning heat. The healers tried everything: poultices, tinctures, cooling spells. Nothing touched the unnatural sickness. The bond he shared with his daughter, a faint echo of the one he'd had with his mate, was screaming. It told him she was not just sick. She was dying. He was losing the last piece of his family, the only reason he had continued to draw breath for the last century. His grief and rage were a perfect silent storm within the castle walls. He felt nothing. He felt everything. In her room, Alara felt it too. It was a faint thrumming at first, a vibration of pain along the nascent bond that connected her to the king, and through him, to his daughter. It was Lyra's pain, Lyra's fear. She could feel the child's life force flickering like a guttering candle. This was not a normal illness, and it was not her curse. She knew that with a certainty that defied all logic. This was something else, something deliberate, something evil. His poison is the blade. The thought came to her out of nowhere, a voice of pure instinct. Whose poison? She saw Lord Valerius's face in her mind, his smooth smile and dead eyes. He had been so quick to condemn her, so eager to see her gone. He was the one who profited from the king's isolation. She had to get to Lyra. The guard at her door was a large, impassive wolf named Kael. She waited until he brought her evening meal. As he turned to leave, she threw herself at the door, blocking his path. "You have to let me out," she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. "The princess is in danger, I can help her." Kyle looked down at her, his expression unmoved. "My orders are from the king. You are to remain here." "Your king is watching his daughter die," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "If you let that happen, his orders won't matter anymore because there will be nothing left of him to rule. I am not the curse. I am the cure. Please, you have to believe me." Something in her fierce conviction, in the wild, desperate truth in her eyes, gave him pause. He was a father himself. He had seen the princess with this girl. He had seen the child's first smile in years. He wavered, and in that moment of hesitation, Ilara acted. She shoved past him, ducking under his arm, and ran. Alarms sounded. Shouts echoed down the corridors. Guards appeared, trying to block her path. She dodged and weaved, fueled by pure adrenaline and a love so fierce it was a fire in her blood. She didn't know where the strength came from, but she was faster and stronger than she had ever been. She had to reach Lyra. Nothing else mattered. She burst through the doors to the royal wing and skidded to a halt at the entrance to Lyra's chamber. The room was filled with grim-faced healers, anxious lords, and the serpentine form of Lord Valerius, who watched the scene with a predatory stillness. And in the center of it all was the king. He knelt by his daughter's bed, his massive shoulders slumped in defeat. He was holding Lyra's limp hand, his face a gray mask of utter despair. He looked up as Ilara entered, and his eyes, no longer golden but dull as lead, filled with a renewed, blazing fury. "Get out!" he roared, the sound ripping from his throat, a promise of violence so profound the very stones seemed to tremble. "Get her out!" The guards surged forward, but Ilara stood her ground. All her fear was gone, burned away by the certainty that pulsed within her. She pointed a trembling finger at the king's advisor. "You are killing her," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. It cut through the king's rage, stunning the room into silence. "Your grief is a shield that blinds you, but his poison is the blade." Valerius's smooth facade finally cracked. A flicker of panic crossed his face. "The girl is mad. The curse has driven her insane. Seize her." But Theron was staring at Ilara, something in her words, in her absolute conviction, piercing the fog of his grief. Ilara ignored them all. She walked forward, her eyes locked on the small, still form in the bed. She moved as if in a dream, pushing past the stunned healers until she reached Lyra's side. The king was still kneeling there, a wounded lion, ready to strike. She did not look at him. She only had eyes for the child. Lyra was barely breathing. The heat rolling off her small body was terrifying. This was a life being extinguished. Ilara reached down and took Lyra's other hand. Her own touch, as always, was cool. The contrast between her skin and the child's raging fever was stark. She held the small, burning hand in both of her own, and she closed her eyes. She remembered her shame. "I break things." She remembered the king's touch. It is not the touch of death. She remembered the love she felt for this child, a love that was pure and unconditional and fierce enough to burn down the world. She refused to let go. She poured every ounce of her will, every shred of her soul into that connection. She did not pray to the goddess who had abandoned her. She prayed to the life force of the child herself, begging it to stay, offering her own in exchange if she must. "Live," she pleaded silently. "Please, live." And then, something broke inside her. A dam she never knew existed, a wall of ice that had encased her heart her entire life, shattered into a million pieces. Warmth flooded her body. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a torrent, a rushing river of fire and light. It surged down her arms and into her hands, which began to glow. A soft green-gold luminescence, the color of new leaves in the spring sun, enveloped her hands and Lyra's. The room gasped. The king stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. The light flowed from Alara into the child. It was a cleansing fire, a torrent of pure life. It sought out the unnatural sickness, the creeping poison that had taken root in Lyra's system, and it burned it away to nothing. The raging fever subsided instantly, replaced by a gentle, natural warmth. The child's shallow breathing deepened, evening out into the soft rhythm of peaceful sleep. Alara's power was not a curse that drained life. It was a gift that gave it. The coldness had been a seal, a suppression of a magic so profound, her young body had not been able to contain it. The shame she had carried was a lie. Valerius saw it all. He saw his plan turning to ash. He saw the king's dawning comprehension. He saw the proof of Alara's power. In a final, desperate act of madness, he drew a hidden dagger from his sleeve and lunged, not at the king, but at Alara. If he could not have the kingdom, he would destroy the one who had saved it. He never made it. Theron moved. He was not a king or a man. He was a blur of shadow and fury, an ancient predator unleashed. He intercepted Valerius mid-stride, his hand clamping around the traitor's throat. There was a single, sickening crack, and it was over. Theron let the body fall to the floor without a second glance. His entire world, his entire universe, had shrunk to the two figures by the bed. His gaze was fixed on Alara, on her glowing hands, on the miracle she had just performed. The storm of his grief had finally, after a century of raging, broken. The green-gold light slowly faded from Alara's hands, leaving behind a lingering warmth she had never felt before. She was trembling, drained, but filled with a strange new power. She looked down at Lyra. The child's eyelids fluttered. They opened. The sky blue was no longer clouded with fever, but was clear and bright. She looked at Alara, a soft, sleepy smile gracing her lips. Then her gaze shifted, moving past Alara to the massive, kneeling figure of her father. Her own lips parted. A small, raspy sound emerged, the first sound she had made in 5 years. Papa. The word, so small, so simple, shattered the last of King Theron's defenses. A choked sob escaped him. The sound was raw, torn from a place of grief so deep he had forgotten it existed. The great Alpha King, the Wolf of the North, fell to his knees, his face finally breaking, a century of ice melting in a flood of tears. He looked at Alara, and the awe, the gratitude, the love in his eyes was so potent it stole her breath. He saw her now, not as an exile, not as a stray, but as his salvation, his queen. You, he breathed, the word a prayer. He reached out, not with the force of a king, but with the trembling hesitation of a man who has been given a gift he knows he does not deserve. He gently took her hand, the one that had just channeled pure life. It was warm, so wonderfully, blessedly warm. He brought her hand to his cheek, pressing it against his tear-streaked skin. He closed his eyes, savoring the feeling, the proof that this was real. I was wrong, he whispered, his voice thick and broken. Forgive me. I was a blind fool. I am so sorry. He didn't wait for an answer. He opened his eyes, and his gaze was a vow. He surged to his feet, pulling her up with him. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, and with the other, he gently scooped his daughter from the bed. He held them both, his 2 precious girls, his resurrected family, tucking them against his massive frame as if he could shield them from all the darkness in the world. He buried his face in Alara's hair, his voice a ragged, possessive growl against her ear. Mine. The word was not a claim of ownership. It was a statement of fact. a recognition of a truth his soul had known from the moment she had knelt on his kitchen floor. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place, of two broken halves of a whole finally, blessedly, coming together. In the ruins of his grief, surrounded by the wreckage of his past, Theron had found his future. And Alara, the blighted one, had finally found her home. 6 months later, the Icefang Citadel was transformed. The oppressive chill that had clung to the stones for a century had receded, replaced by a tentative warmth. Greenery now trailed from window boxes, and the formerly barren courtyard gardens were showing the first stubborn shoots of new life. Queen Alara's touch, once a source of shame, was now the source of the kingdom's renewal. She walked through the corridors, no longer a hunched, invisible servant, but a queen in her own right. The court, which had once whispered about her curse, now bowed in genuine reverence. They had all seen the miracle. They had all witnessed the rebirth of their king. Lyra was her constant, chattering shadow. The child's voice, once silent, now filled the castle with laughter and questions. She had not only regained her speech, but had embraced it with the joy of someone given a second chance at sound. She still used the silent language with Alara, their own secret way of speaking, but now it was a game, a bond of love rather than a necessity of silence. Theron was a changed man. The harsh lines of grief on his face had softened. The cold fire in his eyes had been banked, replaced by a steady, golden warmth that was reserved entirely for his family. He was still the powerful Alpha King, decisive and strong, but the crushing loneliness that had defined him was gone. Alara found him on the high balcony overlooking the kingdom, the same place where he had once stood as a monument to his own sorrow. The wind was sharp, but she no longer felt the cold. A gentle warmth now lived permanently beneath her skin, a gift from her unlocked magic. He turned as she approached, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was a sight that still made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. He had been so broken, and she had been given the gift of helping him heal. He said nothing, simply opened his arms. She went to him without hesitation, pressing herself against the solid wall of his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her securely, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the sun set over the snow-dusted pines. "Do you remember what I told you?" He murmured into her hair, his voice a low rumble she felt through her entire body. "That there was a chasm between us?" She nodded against his chest. "I remember." "I was wrong," he said simply. "There was never a chasm. It was a bridge. I was just too blind to see it." He tilted her chin up, his golden eyes searching hers. The love in them was deep and absolute. "You did not just save my daughter, Ilara. You saved me. From myself. From the ice. You brought the spring back to my world. And you," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup his jaw, "saw me when no one else would. You gave me a home when I was nothing but an exile." It was the truth of their bond, a mutual rescue. He, the most powerful man in the world, had needed her, the most worthless, to be made whole. And she had needed his belief in her to discover the truth of her own power. Lyra came running out onto the balcony then, her cheeks pink from the cold, holding a small, clumsily woven crown of winter roses. "For you, Mama," she said, her voice clear and bright as a bell. Alara knelt as Lyra placed the crown on her head, the thorns carefully removed. She hugged the little girl tightly, her heart overflowing. When she looked up, Theron was watching them, his expression one of pure, unadulterated happiness. He knelt beside them, wrapping his massive arms around them both, pulling them into a tight family embrace. The world had once discarded her as a blight. A king had once feared her as a curse. But here, held in the arms of her king and their daughter, Surrounded by the life she had brought back to a frozen kingdom, Ilara was finally, completely home. The past was a scar, but the future was a garden waiting to bloom.